So I'm going to be talking about three particular points. I'm going to be talking about the goal, constraints, and the medium. When I first started the channel, my very first video was about what is design. And in that video, I am just exploring and trying to define what is design. I kind of did that video and I said that I was going to do a second part for the video. I never did because I'm trying different things for the channel. Kind of started focusing more on the design breakdowns rather than the theory and philosophy. But I did had someone that requested the second part of that video. So this follow-up video is focusing on design, trying to define design from the verb perspective. So it's really a question of how to design. The conclusion of that video for what is design, so design as a noun, is design is the result of the effort to create a specific and optimal human experience. From a verb standpoint, so how to design, there is already a methodology that tries to break down the process of design. And these are what is known as design thinking. So some examples of design thinking are the double diamond approach or the inspire, ideate, and implement approach. So I'm not going to be talking about those particular approaches or tactics to be able to go through the process of design. I'm trying to keep building up this conceptual framework of what is design, how to design, just design in general, in which those tactics live in. I think this conceptual framework is very, very important. This is just a part of a larger endeavor on my part, to create a coherent, cohesive, and comprehensive framework to understand what is design, how to design, why we design in general. So I'm going to be talking about three particular points. I'm going to be talking about the goal, constraints, and the medium. So let's start with the goal. The first thing on this how to design framework is you have to define the goal. So within the goal, you have three things that I look into. So you have direction, you have hierarchy, and you have optimization. So direction is when you are setting a specific endpoint, a specific direction that you're aiming for with your design. This is important because design, at least the way that I see it, design is nothing more at its essence that answering a question of what is the best way to do something? What is the best way to write a card? What is the best way to play a video game? What is the best way of doing anything? What is the best human experience that you can create? Setting a particular direction that you're aiming for helps you to create focus and understand everything else that you're not designing for. And this means that you need to formulate that question correctly, in the sense that if you don't understand what you're designing for, if you don't understand where you're trying to get to, you will not be able to create that design that will get you to that point that you're trying to get to. By you understanding your direction, it helps you to avoid adding scope, right? What it's called as feature creep. It really helps you to focus, to keep in mind what you're actually trying to achieve. And by you having to decide what that direction is, that's going to send you in a whole journey on its own to really define and understand if it's really worth doing what you're doing. If someone else is not doing it, why or what is the particular way that you're trying to do? Like what's the new innovative way that you're trying to do this thing? Then the second point is hierarchy. So hierarchy is once you have your goal set, it's never as simple as one thing. It's going to take one step to do this to achieve this goal with my design. Human experience, the human endeavor is very complex, and even when we try to drill it down as to its simplest iteration, it's always ends up having multiple pieces. So when you establish a hierarchy of these subpoints within your goal, that is going to help you make better and faster decisions when inevitably you have to choose what is more important. This always happens. This will always happen. You have to decide what is more important than other things. And this is important because you cannot design for everything. You have to choose what you're designing for. And when push comes to shove, you need to understand beforehand what is more important in your design. At a certain point, their overlaps end and their differences start coming out. And that's where the tension starts happening. And that's where the decisions between this one particular design decision is going to lean to favor one versus the other. Now, if you already have that hierarchy of importance established, you don't have to waste time trying to figure out or explore which one. I mean, you could explore it if you want to. For the sake of going through the process, you don't need to sit down and consider that question now because you already did. So you can just quickly make the decision and move forward. Then the third thing is optimization, which of course needs the direction of the goal, needs the hierarchy of importance. So the optimization is where you're really trying to drill down and all of your decisions are trying to create one specific optimal experience as best as you can. Again, the principle of trying to do that, trying to create the most specific or trying to design for the most specific scenario is always going to yield a better design. Now, why do I say this? So on the screen here now, I'm going to show a diagram and a way that I like to think about this tension of breadth of solutions of design versus depth of the solution. And in this case, you're seeing a triangle that has various vertical lines equidistanced from each other. And as you can see on the top part of this inverted triangle, it's the point where you have the most lines meeting that one horizontal line. So that is the amount, or the way that I'm seeing, that is the breadth of solutions. Now, if you keep going down that triangle and you get closer and closer down to the tip of that inverted triangle, you see that only one line ends up being the deepest. And this is a way that I like to visualize. If I narrow the amount of things that I'm trying to design for, I'm able to create a deeper, more fine-tuned experience that if I am trying to provide a solution for 1,000 things. Give an example is a Swiss knife versus a chef's knife. A Swiss knife, it has everything, but it's not good at anything, versus a chef's knife. A chef's knife is meant to do one thing, one type of cut, but it's the best at that. And the experience of using that knife is highly comfortable. Its utility, its functionality is optimized for the performance, for how you grip it, for every single decision, from choosing the steel, from the grip, location, size, length of the blade, everything, every decision is being made for that one top point at that hierarchy of importance to be able to achieve that goal of creating the best, the optimal cutting experience. Now, I am not saying that the Swiss knife does not have any value as a design. It does. The Swiss knife might be the optimal way of being able to provide that plurality of functionalities for the tools in one small package. But it's never going to be the best at the knife. It's never going to be the best with its scissors. It's never going to be the best with any of the tools that it has. Those 3 points, direction, hierarchy, and optimization, encapsulate defining the goal. Now let's move up to the second one, which is establishing the constraints. With establishing the constraints, we have identifying the constraints, understanding the constraints, and challenging the constraints. So, identifying the constraints. There are 2 types of constraints that you really have to be on the lookout. These are the soft constraints and the hard constraints. So, the hard constraints are the ones that are almost non-negotiable, that come from an authority source. These could be from the client or the city or any other body of authority. that might be regulating the industry of design. An example of these hard constraints are client budget, client timeline. If you're doing architecture or any type of urban project, regulations from the city, from zoning. If you are into product design, any industry, manufacturing standards. So all of these things are what I consider hard constraints. Now, soft constraints are those constraints that come as an added layer that will make the design better. For example, one of those soft constraints could be contextual considerations. Let's say if you're doing a building and you're next to the river, you don't have to be looking at the river. You don't have to have a deck towards the river. You don't have to see the river. But if you recognize it, if you try to incorporate the sounds of the river, the visuals of the river, your building is going to be a much beautiful, appealing place to be in. Another type of soft constraint could be a specific type of user experience that you're trying to create, or any cultural adaptation, right? It's not the same designing for an American audience versus a European audience. There's cultural differences, and those do need to be taken into account to create that optimized design for that particular person or group. Then after identifying the constraints, you have to understand the constraints. So what do I mean by this? Understanding the constraints is really about understanding how all of those hard and soft constraints relate to each other, and what is that space in between them that is left for you to make decisions within or navigate that design. So for example, if I'm trying to build a house and I know that the zoning does not let me go more than 3 floors high, then I know it's out of the question building a 4-story high house. So I don't have to consider that. I can't consider it. And the bandwidth of decisions and options that I have to now take into account becomes narrower. And if I understand the design space that is built, that is left by the established constraints, I'm going to have a much, much easier time navigating and arriving at the exploration, the iterations, and at the optimal design that I'm after if I'm not bumping and exploring and finding out things as I am designing. So another way to visualize the constraints of understanding the constraints. When you start with tic-tac-toe, you have a grid of 3x3 spaces, a total of 9 spaces. When the game starts, whoever is the first player has the option of putting their mark on any of those 9 squares, those 9 spaces. Once the second player goes, now they don't have the choice of 9 spaces. They have 8 spaces to choose from, and now they have to consider where the first player put their mark. And as the game keeps progressing, less and less space is able to be considered for the game moves. And that is a very similar way of how I'm trying to picture this navigation of design. You have to understand your grid of possibilities when you're designing. You have to put all the marks in all the spaces that need to be, that are representing the constraints. And then you understand where you can move, where you can make your next move as a designer. Then third, you need to understand when to challenge the constraints. So not every constraint is the correct one. Not every constraint needs to be respected. More than not, they do need to be challenged. Constraints are not bad. We need constraints. By having constraints, we can define and differentiate what we're doing, what we're designing for. Just again, think about the Swiss knife versus a chef knife. The Swiss knife is trying to not have any constraints. It's trying to provide every and all the tools that it can. Unfortunately, reality is a constraint. So if it wants to do all that in a small package, then space is limited. So there's always constraints. You just have to choose with what constraints, or as a designer, you do have some point of control over what constraints you work within, but there are always going to be constraints, and they're not bad. Constraints breed creativity. Now, there are some constraints. Again, if we keep talking about, or if we revert back to the hard constraints, those constraints are going to have a higher friction required to change them, right? If the client comes with a budget, that client probably spent a few weeks, a few meetings trying to determine how much money they can actually put forward for the project. So that's not going to be something easy to change. It has changed, it does change, but it's not going to be easy to change. So as a designer, you usually want to first try to change whatever you can or define in the soft constraints. If you, with the space, the design space that is left with the hard constraints and the soft constraints is not good enough to be able to create that optimal good design, that's when you need to start looking at that framework of constraints. And then there's a point that you will have to go and change constraints. Now, if changing the soft constraints is not enough to create a good design, then that's where you come knocking on the hard constraints. Okay, so we've talked about goals, we've talked about constraints. The third point is understanding the medium. And this is something that haven't really heard anyone talk about this. So there are 3 points in this major point of the medium. You have to choose your medium if you're able to. You have to understand your medium, and you have to accept your medium. Choosing your medium if you're able to. Not everybody is going to be able to choose the medium, but in some sense, you do need to see if your medium is the best way to achieve that goal that you're after. A medium is that which you will be using to create that particular experience in. It could be through architecture, through a game, could be through a painting, could be through a writing, a musical composition. Here, I'm really looking at all the different design fields as different mediums. And this decision-making process that has been happening from your goal, that has been happening within your constraints, has and tries to understand what that decision-making process is going to be manipulating, right? Is your decision-making process for architecture? Is it for game design? Is it for product design? Is it for landscaping? Is it within a musical composition? Is it within or for a written piece? All these things are different. All these things are going to provide you different tools to achieve that goal. Now, nowadays, we have become as a society, we have become hyper specialized in one thing, right? We're a piece of a greater puzzle or a greater machine. So not everybody has this option of choosing the medium. This is something that used to happen more, or at least in a more prominent way. For example, in the Renaissance, right? Where you had people that could sculpt, that could paint, that could sketch, that could engineer, that could build architecture. They could do all different things. These days, everybody kind of has like one thing that they can do. So it's more about, this decision falls more onto the client to choose the designer, to choose the medium, rather than the designer being able to choose a medium. So after you choose the medium, you have to understand your medium. You have to understand the particular strengths and weaknesses of that medium within the goals and constraints that you have set. A way to explain this: if you want to describe the layout of a room, is it better to write it out or draw it out versus trying to compose a musical score that tries to describe the layout of the room? Versus if you're trying to express how someone feels, is it better to write about it? Is it better to draw about it? Or is it better to kind of articulate the emotional tones within a musical composition? Everything has its pros and its cons. You can't use a hammer for everything. If you use a hammer and you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So you have to be very careful about this point. Once you choose the medium, once you understand the medium, you have to accept the medium. Is this medium that you have, that you're going to use, the best way to articulate and achieve your design goal. If you want to provide housing for someone, it's probably architecture is going to be your best shot at creating the optimal housing experience, not a musical composition, not a novel about a great house. If you want to create the best communication tool, that's probably going to be product design. It's not going to be architecture. So once you accept the medium, you understand the strengths and the weaknesses of that particular medium, do not try to use that medium as anything else. Do not try to describe the room arrangement through music. I mean, another way of thinking about this that might help someone visualize it better. Can't really drill a screw with a hammer. You can't really hammer a nail with a screwdriver. The cello versus the piccolo. Each one has their role. Each one has their role. The cello tends to be used more for its presence, right? It has a stronger resonance, sound profile. It's on the low end, so you kind of like feel it in the chest. You can really create heavy atmospheres with it because its sound range is on the lower end. Physically speaking, the way that the sound waves undulate is bigger. Going from one note to another doesn't happen as fast, doesn't happen as articulated and as clean, versus the piccolo, which has a higher profile sound, tends to be used more for articulation, right? It has very fast articulated melodies, tends to sound happier, lighter. So if you try to use the piccolo to create the Jaws theme, it kind of like doesn't feel as serious, right? As if you're using the cello. Or understanding your instrument, understanding your medium, understanding what you're designing in, it's key to creating that optimal design within those constraints that you have identified to achieve that particular goal that you're aiming for. That's it for the 3 points of that framework. So again, we have the defining the goal, establishing the constraints, and understanding the medium. And to close this off, as I stated earlier in the video, design is an answer to the question of what is the best way of experiencing X. X is whatever you're aiming for. The design definition that I ended up creating or finding in that first video, which again, I encourage you to go see it, that was the noun definition. So if we add the verb design definition, that's kind of like the one that comes out of all this framework, all this video, is design is the result of the effort to create a specific and optimal human experience through a decision-making process that articulates a specific medium. Why is having this framework, why is having this definition so important? Well, by having a conceptual framework, you're going to avoid designing with no real direction or understanding. You're going to be more efficient, not to be faster. The point is not to be faster, but it's to be able to spend the limited time that you have really trying to iterate in the right direction to find that one good design. This is also going to avoid you having to bump into questions, right? Like finding out constraints afterwards and losing time trying to understand and fight that constraint helps you to define that design space to be able to move through it faster. That's it for this video. So remember to like, subscribe, and share the video. It really does help with YouTube as I'm trying to grow the channel, trying to invest more time to the channel to try to do different videos, like, keep exploring the design breakdowns, this type of video, which is more theoretical and philosophical. Let me know if you do like this type of video so I can do more of them. Comment down below. I always looking forward to have a conversation about design. Just let me know what other future topic videos you would like me to do or talk about. This video is I'm doing this video because someone asked it. Hope you enjoy the video, and I will see you on the next one.